She slammed the drawer shut. "You stole from me," she said. "Now get out." 11 years of loyalty, gone in a heartbeat. And the woman who had raised her grandson like her own was thrown out with nothing. But 3 nights later, a sound from the basement. Footsteps. Breathing. She grabbed a flashlight, heart pounding, ready to face a trespasser. But when the beam hit the corner of the furnace, there she was. Not hiding. Not stealing. Just lying there, exhausted, protecting the boy who hadn't spoken since she left. This wasn't theft. It was love, the kind that never leaves, even when you're told to. And in that moment, the widow realized. Sometimes the people we cast out are the only ones keeping the house from falling down. Before we dive in, click the like button, subscribe for more powerful true tales, and stay until the end. The twist will leave you speechless. Get out of my house. The scream tore through the Whitmore estate like a gunshot in a chapel. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was betrayal, confusion, anger, and something deeper she couldn't name. Margaret Whitmore, once Margaret Langston, debutante ballet patron, Palm Beach widow, stood frozen in the grand hallway, barefoot in her monogrammed silk nightgown, her breath fogging in the cold air of her own home. In one hand, she clutched a fireplace poker, in the other, a flashlight that shook with each unsteady heartbeat. Something had moved in the basement. Again. She told herself the sounds were rats, or the house settling, or maybe her mind slipping, as her sister had warned it would after Jonathan passed. But this time, she knew she hadn't imagined it. A muffled cough, and then the unmistakable sound of mattress springs shifting. Her flashlight's beam danced as she took the narrow servant's stairwell down. Dust brushed against her nightgown. The air grew damp, colder the deeper she went. A place once used for wine and silverware now smelled of rust and memory. She reached the basement door, took a breath, pushed it open. The room beyond was barely lit, the single bulb above swaying on a loose wire. The cellar was cluttered with old furniture covered in sheets, forgotten trunks, and wooden shelves lined with expired canned peaches and dusty bottles of vinegar. She stepped further in. That's when she saw it. A figure, curled on a thin mattress near the boiler. Blankets bunched up to the shoulders. A small duffel bag tucked beneath one arm like a pillow. Shoes neatly placed beside the makeshift bed. Her hand tightened on the poker. "Who's there?" she demanded, heart pounding. The figure stirred, lifted her head. Margaret gasped so hard it felt like her lungs had collapsed. It wasn't a burglar. It wasn't a stranger. It was Jolene. Her maid. Her former maid. The one she'd fired 3 nights ago. 3 days earlier, the bracelet had gone missing. Not just any bracelet, but the bracelet. Platinum, with hand-laid sapphires. A gift from Jonathan on their 25th wedding anniversary. He'd died 8 years later, but the bracelet remained. Always in the same velvet box on the kitchen counter. Always placed back after her morning tea. Until that morning, Margaret had searched everywhere, then narrowed her gaze. Only one person had been in the house that day. Jolene. For 11 years, Jolene had cooked, cleaned, and cared for her grandson Oliver like he was her own. She'd been there when Margaret was still adjusting to widowhood. When Oliver was diagnosed. When the therapists gave up. But sentiment didn't matter when trust was broken. "You're accusing me?" Jolene had asked, her voice low, her posture straight. "I'm not accusing," Margaret snapped. "I'm observing facts. You were the last person near it. I moved it. It was near the sink. I put it away so it wouldn't get wet." "In a drawer?" "Yes. I looked. It's not there." Jolene held her tongue for a moment, then said, "I've never taken a dime from you. Not once." Margaret's jaw clenched. Her pride answered before her reason could. "Pack your things." "Ma'am Oliver." "Pack your things. Now." Jolene folded her apron without another word. Took her small bag. Left through the servant's entrance. No goodbye. No defense. Just silence. Back in the basement. Margaret blinked, struggling to make sense of it. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, half in disbelief, half in rage. Jolene pushed herself up slowly, not startled, not afraid, just tired. Her hair was wrapped in a scarf. She wore an old hoodie and sweatpants. Her eyes, glassy with exhaustion, met Margaret's without flinching. "I heard him screaming," Jolene said softly. "I couldn't stay away." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She didn't have to ask who him was. Oliver. Her grandson. 9 years old. Autistic. Brilliant. Fragile. Nonverbal. And ever since Jolene left, he'd changed. He barely ate. Refused to sleep. Scratched his skin until it bled. He stared at walls and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. He lashed out at the nanny Margaret hired the next day. Screamed when the speech therapist showed up. Broke 2 plates and a lamp. The doctor called it regression. Margaret called it something worse. Loss. But she hadn't made the connection, not fully. Until now. "I only stayed in the basement," Jolene said. "Didn't touch a thing. Just waited for the lights to go out, and made sure he was okay. He sleeps better when I'm nearby. Margaret didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened. You broke in, she finally choked out. I used the key under the planter. The same one you told me to use in case of emergency. This wasn't an emergency. Jolene stood now slowly, calmly. It was to him. Margaret's hands trembled. I should call the police. You can, Jolene said, folding the blanket. But they'll ask why a woman who was fired 3 days ago risked arrest just to watch over a child she didn't birth and didn't steal from. Margaret stepped back. Her mind flashed to the bracelet again, and the small voice in her head whispered, what if she really didn't take it? The silence stretched. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then a sound from upstairs. A soft cry. High-pitched. Repetitive. Margaret knew it instantly. Oliver. Another nightmare. Jolene didn't wait. She stepped past Margaret, up the stairs, barefoot and steady. Margaret didn't stop her. Couldn't. She followed silently. By the time they reached Oliver's room, he was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide, fingers tapping rapidly against the sheets, his way of stimmying when he was in distress. He didn't look at his grandmother. But when Jolene stepped into the room, he reached for her. Without a word. Without hesitation. And as Jolene knelt beside the bed and rubbed his back in slow, comforting circles, the boy's breathing slowed. His fingers stilled. He laid back down, hands still clutching hers. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching a bond no money could buy, no title could earn. And for the first time in days, the house was quiet. Not just quiet, whole. And she realized, she hadn't just fired a maid. She'd exiled the only person he trusted. Oliver never cried. Not even when his mother left. Not even when Jonathan died. And not when the doctors told Margaret that her grandson's condition was severe, lifelong, and unlikely to improve. Instead of tears, Oliver responded to grief with silence. With tense shoulders. With long stares into the corners of rooms, as if listening to something no one else could hear. His pain was private. Invisible. But just as real. Margaret had watched him for years, hoping for a miracle. But the closest thing they ever got was Jolene. It started when Oliver was 3. Jolene was a new hire then. Just a part-time maid. She'd come twice a week to clean the downstairs wing and prepare Jonathan's meals. She was polite, quiet, and always early. Margaret liked her immediately. But she never expected the woman to see Oliver, not really. No one ever did. But one morning, after a tantrum that left 3 picture frames shattered and a therapist in tears, Jolene had done something unexpected. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She didn't speak. She simply sat on the floor beside him, cross-legged, silent. And slowly, Oliver stopped screaming. Then he started coloring. He handed her a crayon. From that moment on, he was different. Not fixed, but seen. Not cured, but connected. To her. Back in the present, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, watching the monitor on her phone. Oliver's room camera showed Jolene still sitting at his bedside. It was 4:37 a.m. She hadn't left him once. The boy, normally restless, even in sleep, was calm. His breathing soft, rhythmic. His fingers still wrapped around Jolene's. Margaret tapped the screen, dimming it. She didn't know what to think anymore. 3 days ago, she had been so sure of herself. The bracelet was gone. Jolene was the only one who could have taken it. Case closed. But now nothing felt certain. Not her memory. Not her judgment. Not even her role in this child's life. 8:02 a.m. Margaret stood in the hallway outside Oliver's room. Jolene opened the door slowly, stepping out with tired eyes and a soft yawn. He's still asleep, she whispered. But calmer. Margaret nodded, awkward. You didn't try to leave last night? Jolene looked her in the eye. I did. Twice. But both times he started screaming. I didn't know if it was a coincidence or if he knew. Margaret crossed her arms. You were sleeping in the basement. How long had you been doing that? Jolene hesitated. The day after I was fired. 3 nights. Jolene nodded. In the cold? On the floor? It wasn't about comfort. Margaret's voice was quieter now. Why not call me? Ask to come back. You already judged me, Mrs. Whitmore. There was no space left for asking. Later that morning, Margaret entered the side sitting room, one of Jonathan's favorites, and sat in his old leather chair. She looked at the fireplace mantel, at the photos arranged in stiff rows. Her wedding portrait, Oliver's christening, a beach trip in 2011. In every photo of Oliver, he looked the same. Stiff posture, wide eyes, unsmiling. Except one. He was on Jolene's lap. Age 6. Mouth open in something almost like a laugh. Crayons scattered across the table. His hand was holding hers. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed. Diane, it's Margaret. Her friend's voice was chipper. Darling, I was just thinking about your gala. I need to ask you something. Of course. You remember when you visited last summer? You were wearing that awful feathered brooch? The purple one? Yes. You dropped it near the sink. Jolene handed it to you. Remember? Oh yes, dear, she found it in the drawer. I'd forgotten all about that. Margaret paused. In the side drawer? That's right. Why? Margaret didn't answer. She just hung up. Rushing into the dining room, she flung open the drawer near the buffet table. Her heart caught. There, nestled between napkin rings and a stack of forgotten Christmas cards, the bracelet. Untouched. Shining. Cold. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. She stared at it for a long time, then sat down. Hard. Downstairs, Jolene was packing her duffel. She wasn't sure what came next. She'd meant to stay only a few nights, just to check on Oliver, to be sure he wasn't spiraling. But now she had nowhere to go. No job. No references. What would people say? What would they assume? A black woman sneaking into a mansion in the dead of night. She folded her blanket, slipped her shoes on, and turned toward the stairs. Then, don't go. Margaret's voice echoed from the top step. Jolene froze. I found it, Margaret said. The bracelet. You told the truth. Jolene didn't speak. I misjudged you, Margaret added. Still, Jolene said nothing. Because sometimes forgiveness felt cheap. Too easy. Later that day, Margaret watched as Oliver played with his toy train, a red one that usually sat untouched. He pushed it along the rug with calm precision, making soft humming sounds. She hadn't seen him this peaceful in days. Jolene was nearby, folding laundry. Margaret stepped into the room, cleared her throat. I've spoken to my attorney. Jolene looked up. If you're willing, Margaret said, I'd like to hire you back. Jolene raised an eyebrow. As what? As Oliver's caregiver. Not your maid. No. I think that job is obsolete. Jolene folded the shirt slowly. I'll need a raise. Margaret blinked, then smiled. Of course. That night, Oliver did something extraordinary. He brought Jolene a crayon drawing. In it, a tall woman stood beside a boy. There were no mouths, no eyes, just two figures drawn in a swirl of yellow. And between them, a line, connecting hand to hand. It wasn't art. It was understanding. The bracelet glimmered under the soft kitchen light, as if mocking Margaret with its quiet presence. How many times had she walked past that drawer? How many times had she repeated the same story in her mind? Asterisk, Jolene took it. Jolene betrayed me. Jolene shattered my trust. Asterisk, it had become a gospel of certainty, rehearsed and repeated until it felt like truth. But there it was, right where Jolene said it would be. Margaret stared at the velvet box, her hands numb. She didn't pick it up. Not yet. She wasn't ready to feel the weight of it again. Not after what she'd done. She closed the drawer, and went to find her. Jolene was in the sunroom, folding Oliver's pajamas. Her hair was tied up in a loose scarf, and her expression was calm. The same expression she always wore when working, like her heart had learned how to be still in the service of others. Margaret stood at the doorway watching her. She didn't speak right away. Didn't know how. It had been so long since she'd apologized to someone without strings attached. So instead, she asked a question. Why didn't you tell me again? Jolene folded the last pajama top and placed it in the basket. She didn't look up. I did, she said. Margaret swallowed. I mean after I fired you. Jolene finally met her eyes. Would you have listened? Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it, because the truth hung in the air between them, heavy, undeniable. No, she wouldn't have listened. She didn't want truth. She wanted closure. And Jolene had been the easiest place to put her pain. They sat in silence for a few minutes before Margaret finally spoke again. I found the bracelet. Jolene didn't react. It was in the drawer. The one near the sink. I know. You were right. I know that too. Margaret looked away. I'm sorry. This time, Jolene looked up. Not cold. Not angry. Just exhausted. People think apologies fix things, she said quietly. But sometimes they just name the thing we already lived through. Margaret blinked. That's not forgiveness? It's survival. Margaret sat down across from her. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I do need to tell you something. Jolene waited. Margaret reached into her robe pocket and placed the bracelet on the table. I wore this the day Jonathan proposed, she said. And on the day we buried him. I held it in my hand while waiting for Oliver's diagnosis. It's not just a thing. It's part of my grief. Jolene nodded slowly. I understand. I thought losing it meant I was losing him again. Or forgetting him. And blaming me gave the grief a target. Margaret looked away in shame. Yes. Jolene sat back. You didn't just fire me, she said. You erased 11 years of loyalty with a single doubt. Margaret closed her eyes. I know. I was here when your husband's heart failed. I cleaned his blood off the marble when the paramedics left. I stayed up all night when Oliver had his seizures. I defended you when the neighborhood whispered that you were cold, or cruel, or unfit to raise a special needs child. I showed up every morning, whether I was grieving or sick or tired. And the first time something went missing. You were the first suspect, Margaret finished, voice breaking. They sat in it, the bitter truth. Like a wound they could finally see. Later that day, Margaret made a call to her estate manager and told him to cancel the agency's new hires. She didn't need a rotating cast of nannies and temp workers. She needed someone who already knew how to speak Oliver's silent language. She needed Jolene. But needing her wasn't the same as deserving her. That afternoon, Oliver refused to eat unless Jolene was seated beside him. He lined up his peas in a perfect rectangle, then placed one into her hand. She smiled and played along, pretending it was treasure. He giggled. Margaret watched from across the kitchen island, amazed. Her grandson hadn't laughed since the funeral. After Oliver was tucked into bed, Margaret met Jolene in the hallway. I want to change things, she said. Jolene raised an eyebrow. Change what? Our arrangement. I thought we agreed. Not just that, Margaret said, waving her hand. I mean everything. Pay. Role. Status. Jolene crossed her arms. You're not going to hand me some fancy title and think it erases the way you treated me. Margaret smiled weakly. No. But I want to make sure that from this day forward, no one in this house thinks of you as the help. You're Oliver's person. His anchor. And in some ways more family than some of mine ever were. Jolene looked down, unsure how to respond. Margaret took a breath. I want to put your name on his emergency contacts. And authorize you to make decisions when I can't. Jolene's eyes widened. That's a lot of trust. I know, Margaret said. But it's also long overdue. That night, Margaret wrote a note. It wasn't for Jolene. It was for herself. She tucked it inside the drawer next to the bracelets box. Next time I misplace something, search the drawer. Not the people who've never failed me. The whispers started on a Tuesday. Margaret heard them first at the grocery store, subtle, like the rustling of tissue paper. A voice just loud enough for her to hear. She took her back, can you believe it? A pause. Well, she has always been odd since the husband died. Margaret didn't turn around. She reached for the carton of eggs, placed them gently in her basket, and walked toward the checkout like she hadn't heard a thing. But it followed her. At the salon. At church. On the community Facebook page. The Whitmore widow, once hailed for her philanthropy and composure, had become gossip. For what? For rehiring a black woman she fired under suspicion of theft? For giving her back the job, but more than that, for giving her authority? Margaret had lived her whole life in control. But this was something different. This wasn't whispered envy over her home, or her jewelry, or her hosting skills. This was judgment. Punishment for crossing an invisible line. She felt it at her HOA meetings. In the long pause before people answered her calls. In the subtle tension of her bridge club, where no one said it directly, but their looks said enough. She had broken code. She had chosen trust over reputation. And they wouldn't let her forget it. That night, as she poured herself a glass of sherry, she saw the flicker of light down the hallway, Oliver's bedroom. She walked slowly, pausing in the doorway. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, Jolene beside him. They weren't speaking, of course not. But they didn't need to. He was handing her Lego bricks one by one, and she was building a tower with painstaking patience. Each time it collapsed, he laughed. Jolene laughed too. Margaret leaned on the doorframe and just watched. Not as a homeowner. Not as a widow. Just as a woman who had nearly destroyed the only piece this boy had left. Later, as Jolene folded towels in the laundry room, Margaret stepped in. There's talk, she said, voice low. Jolene kept folding. I heard it at the grocery store. And Diane made a comment at brunch. Of course she did, Jolene said, not looking up. I just thought you should know. Now Jolene turned to face her. No offense, Mrs. Whitmore, but I've lived a lifetime in other people's whispers. If I paid them all attention, I'd have lost my mind a long time ago. Margaret looked down, ashamed. Still, I hate that they're turning it into scandal. Jolene shrugged. They always do. Especially when the story doesn't fit the one they're comfortable with. Margaret nodded. It's just they think I'm weak. That I've lost my mind. Or, Jolene said quietly, they're afraid of what it says about them. The next day, Margaret posted a message to the neighborhood Facebook group. Not out of anger, but clarity. To those wondering, yes, Jolene is back. Not because she begged. Not because she needed charity. She came back because my grandson needed someone this world never learned how to value. And I'm the one who needed to change, not her. The post racked up hundreds of reactions. Some positives. Many not. She didn't care. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't pretending. 2 nights later, there was a knock at the front door. It was just after dinner, and Oliver had finally fallen asleep after a hard day. Jolene was in the den reading a magazine. Margaret opened the door slowly. A white woman in a slate gray blazer stood on the porch. Mid-40s. Professional. Clipboard in hand. Mrs. Whitmore? Yes. My name is Suzanne. I'm with Child Protective Services. Margaret's heart skipped. CPS? Yes, ma'am. We received a call regarding the supervision of your grandson. Margaret's spine straightened. He's asleep. What's this about? The woman adjusted her glasses. We were told a live-in caregiver was added to the home recently, without proper registration or certification. We'd like to ask some questions. Margaret invited her in, politely but firmly. She motioned to the front sitting room. Would you like tea? She asked. No thank you, Suzanne replied, flipping open her file. I understand a woman named Jolene Carter is now residing on the property. Correct? She's not residing here permanently, Margaret said carefully. She's part of Oliver's care team. Has been for nearly a decade. But she was terminated recently, then returned? Yes. And was rehired informally? Margaret frowned. She was retrusted. Does that need paperwork? Susan didn't smile. Legally, yes. Anyone caring for a child with specific needs must be authorized or approved by a guardian, and reviewed in certain cases. She is approved. By me. We'll need to confirm that with a wellness check. Margaret's patience wore thin. Look, this isn't about paperwork. This is about someone seeing a black woman in a white woman's house and assuming the worst. Suzanne stiffened. I'm sorry, but our report didn't come from a neighbor. Then who? She hesitated. I can't disclose that. Margaret leaned forward. Of course you can't. At that moment, Jolene appeared in the hallway. She paused when she saw the visitor. But she didn't flinch. She walked in calmly, carrying the monitor from Oliver's room. Hi, she said softly. He's asleep. Peacefully. Took me 2 hours. Suzanne looked her over. Ms. Carter, are you CPR certified? Yes. And first aid. I also trained with an autism support foundation in Tampa. Are you a licensed nurse? No. But I've been Oliver's primary contact since he was 4. I know every sound he makes when he's in pain. I know which textures calm him. I know how many seconds it takes before he shuts down if you overload his senses. Suzanne scribbled notes. I'd like to observe your interaction tomorrow. Jolene nodded. Margaret folded her arms. Do you want to stay for breakfast? She asked coldly. Maybe see if we poison his food too? Suzanne blinked. No thank you. I'll return at 9 a.m. She turned, walked out. Margaret closed the door harder than necessary. Jolene looked at her. You okay? No, Margaret muttered. I'm furious. Don't be. Someone called them. Someone saw you and called CPS. They didn't see me, Jolene said. They saw what I let you be. And that scared them more than anything else. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She stood by the upstairs window, watching the garden swaying in the wind. The same garden Jonathan had once planted. The same one Oliver had crawled through at age 5, chasing butterflies, mud on his cheeks. She thought about all the things she used to care about. Country club brunches. Donor plaques. Perfect appearances. And now, she just cared about keeping the one person in this house who knew what love really looked like. The following morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that came after a long day, but the kind that held its breath. Margaret had risen early, her hair already pinned into place, makeup precise, pearls resting on her collar like armor. She moved through the Whitmore estate with purpose, but beneath it all was dread. LCPS was coming, and this time, no one would be watching. Jolene was already in Oliver's room, humming a soft, wordless tune as she helped him into his clothes. The boy giggled when she gently tickled his side while putting on his socks. His favorite red hoodie was laid out on the bed. Margaret paused in the hallway unseen, watching them again, the way Jolene moved like she belonged there. Not as a guest, not as staff, but as someone integrated into the boy's rhythm. Oliver responded in kind, as if her presence regulated him. The way music regulates breath. The way gravity holds things steady. 8:55 a.m. Margaret stood by the front door, arms folded, waiting. Jolene remained with Oliver, working on a visual schedule with him. Blocks of color-coded magnets, each representing a task. Breakfast, therapy, playtime. The doorbell rang. Margaret opened it with a cool expression. Suzanne from CPS stepped inside, this time carrying a rolling case with documents and an iPad. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. Let's make it quick. Susan gave a polite smile. This will only take a few minutes. They began the walkthrough. Suzanne asked standard questions. Fire alarms, medications, allergen control. Then came the observation. She was taken to the den where Jolene sat beside Oliver, helping him with a sensory puzzle. A matching game that involved textures and colors. Oliver was humming. Focused. Happy. Oliver, Jolene said softly, can you show Susan where the soft squares are? The boy looked up, then carefully picked up the fabric pieces with the velvet textures and held them out. Suzanne blinked in surprise. He doesn't usually respond to direct commands from unfamiliar adults, Margaret said, arms crossed proudly. Jolene didn't say anything. She just gave Oliver a gentle smile and a thumbs up. Suzanne nodded slowly, scribbling notes. Once Oliver left the room for snack time, Suzanne turned back. Ms. Carter, do you have any formal degrees in child development or special education? No, ma'am. Then why do you think this boy trusts you so deeply? Jolene hesitated, then said, because I never tried to fix him. I just learned to hear him. Susan didn't respond. She looked down at her notes, scribbled something else, then turned to Margaret. Would you be willing to formalize her employment as a specialized caregiver? Absolutely, Margaret said immediately. I'll sign whatever's needed today. Suzanne nodded. We'll send someone for a follow-up, but I'm not seeing anything here that warrants concern. She began packing up, but then added one last thing. I shouldn't say this, she said, but someone called us with the clear intention of disrupting your arrangement. That kind of malice, it's not about the child's well-being. I figured, Margaret said flatly. Was it anonymous? Suzanne hesitated, then nodded. Of course it was. As the front door closed behind her, Margaret turned back into the house with a long, tired sigh. Jolene was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line. Well, she asked. Margaret smiled faintly. You're officially safe. I wasn't worried about me. I know. Margaret stepped closer. I think I owe you more than just an apology. Jolene looked skeptical. Like what? Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded envelope. Inside, papers with signatures. Legal ones. What's this? Authorization, Margaret said. To make medical and educational decisions for Oliver when I'm unavailable. Power of attorney limited, just for him. And something else. Jolene unfolded the second document. She froze. Margaret, it's trust. For me. For Oliver. But your name is on it. In the event of my passing. Jolene stepped back, overwhelmed. I'm not asking for your money. You're not getting my money, Margaret replied. You're being entrusted with my legacy. That boy is everything I have. And I can't pretend I'll be around forever. Tears welled in Jolene's eyes. He's not just your legacy, she whispered. Margaret nodded. I know. Later that day, they all sat on the porch together. The autumn sun had begun to drift low. The trees along the estate's perimeter cast long shadows across the lawn. Oliver sat between them, legs dangling from the bench. He held a juice box in one hand and Jolene's fingers in the other. He didn't speak. But his silence wasn't empty. It was content. Safe. The wind stirred the chimes. And for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to truly exhale. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a typed note. No matter what papers you sign, the world still sees what it sees. That woman doesn't belong there. Neither does the boy. Some things don't mix. Watch your back. Margaret folded the paper, walked to the fireplace, and lit a match. She watched the words curl into ash. The next day, she contacted her attorney again. Make sure Jolene is fully protected, she said. If anything happens to me, she stays in that house. With him. Yes, ma'am. Margaret hung up. Then walked to the sunroom, where Jolene was laughing with Oliver over a spilled box of crayons. She stood there a while, smiling, because the fire of judgment had come. And it hadn't burned them. It had refined them. That evening, Oliver approached Jolene with a sketch pad. He'd drawn 3 figures. One tall, one medium, one small. 3 stick hands connected. Beneath the image, scrawled in uneven letters. Stay. Jolene looked at Margaret, then back at the boy. And for the first time, the very first time, Oliver looked her in the eye and smiled. A full, unguarded smile. Jolene's hands shook as she whispered, I'm not going anywhere. Sometimes the people we cast out are the only ones keeping the house from falling down.